Dear students, in the years before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I was often asked to speak about the future of the European Union. Many were worried about it. And since then, I have often been asked to speak about the future, not of the European Union, but the future of the world. And again, many are worried about it. So in what kind of world do we live? My first answer is that we live in a dangerous world. But at the same time, I have to say also that we see and notice hopeful developments, even in the recent days, dark days. The current geopolitical developments are dangerous. Why? Because for the past 18 months, there have been regular threats about the use of nuclear weapons. Climate disasters affect all countries of the world, both by water and by fire. These evolutions are new, and we can no longer say with a false wisdom, nothing new under the sun. There is something new. Uncertainty in general has been heightened since the 2008 financial crisis by a succession of events that went by the collective name of the permanent crisis, the so-called perma crisis. After 2008, the Eurozone came under threat, followed by an economic recession. Then there were the refugee influx of 2015, 2016. Afterwards, we had the terrorist attacks in the same period, inter alia in my own city, in Brussels. We had a pandemic that dragged on for 3 years. We had the invasion of Ukraine, high inflation fueled by looming energy shortages, climate disasters, the Israeli-Hamas war, and so on. Each time the causes were different. For EU countries, they were external, except for the euro. That was an internal crisis. And some crises were merely problematic. You always have problems in life. Others were existential. They were about life and death of people, such as COVID and wars. Life and death also concerning economic pillars such as banks and the currency. Even though each time we overcame the problems I mentioned through concerted efforts, we overcame the problems, but still. Many of our fellow citizens were asking the question a few months ago, what is the next crisis? They have had an answer since October 7. An unexpected new war in the world's most dangerous region, the Middle East. And this war affects us as human beings because of the inhumanity there. But for Europeans, we have to say, the immediate impact on the economic and security front is not so great for now. The speed and volatility of certain developments, including political ones, is also very striking. More than ever, it is easier to predict the past than the future. Everything can turn for the better, but uncertainty will remain for a very long time. My second series of reflections start with there are also paradoxical evolutions. And let me give you a few examples. Economic globalization is past its peak, but the globalization of the internet, of music, of film, sport, the globalization of tourism, climate change, and migration continue unabated. It's really a paradox. In this sense, the world is becoming a village. Speaking about economic globalization, it's also changed. It is not always about free markets or economic rationality anymore. Trade and investment are now hampered by a new political priority, the priority for security. And the war in Ukraine has an impact on the world order beyond Ukraine in many ways. I give you a striking example. We are witnessing a growing fragmentation of the global economy, of global trade, into competing blocs. The World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the European Central Bank have given the same warning shot, the fragmentation of the global economy. All major multilateral institutions function with difficulty, or sometimes they are not functioning anymore. Think of the World Trade Organization, and to some extent, even if there was good news yesterday, also the United Nations. The major COP conferences on climate were an exception. They still function, but the last COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh indicated the waning trend. The question is whether the mistrust between global actors can still be overcome in the future when it comes to climate. The latest agreements, not later than yesterday, between the US and China to triple global renewable energy capacity by 2030 are unexpectedly positive. After all, nowhere is the multilateral framework more needed than for climate. It should transcend the rivalries in the world. Until recently, global trust did exist. I spoke about global mistrust, but until recently, global trust did exist. It is not so long ago that the G20 was created at the level of heads of government in response to the financial crisis that brought us to within a few millimeters of an implosion of the international financial system. But today the G20 became rather an event, not a place of decision-making. Another example of previous trust, I'll give you that example. We welcomed China to the World Trade Organization, the WTO, in 2001, and Russia in 2011. This membership contributed to the unprecedented economic rise of China, and it proved the openness and trust of the then WTO members, mostly Western countries. It showed that there was, until recently, trust, global trust. China is already experiencing this global mistrust. Foreign investments in their country declined dramatically last year. There is, of course, the global economic slowdown, but there is the fear about what may happen in the Taiwan Strait. Geopolitics is the main cause of that economic phenomenon. This shows well the global interdependence. It explains why China is looking for more contact with the West again. I just said that geopolitics played a role in the economy, but after the recent contacts that China is looking for, we can also say the economy in turn influences politics. Another paradox. Have we re-entered the Cold War, although no longer on ideological grounds as it was then, but now more motivated simply by power politics, by nationalism? Some say there is no new Cold War, but at least that former Cold War was not a hot war like today. My list of paradoxes is long. The EU went through major crises, but came out of them strengthened simply because for an increasing number of problems, national solutions are no longer sufficient. Europe, the European Union, is needed. It is the Europe of necessity. You should not love Europe, you just cannot miss it. Many national democracies are struggling internally because of the fragmentation of the political landscape, which makes governing at a national level difficult. But those weakened national governments do nevertheless often reach unanimous decisions in the European Council. Speaking about paradoxes, this is a real one. The European Council did act quickly after Brexit and unanimously during at least 4 years on Brexit. And the European Council acted quickly after the Russian invasion. The EU, as a general reflection, can act in times of crisis, but I have to admit, less well outside the times of crisis. Ukraine is a game-changing country for Europe and for the West, for better and for worse, depending on the war's outcome. Ukraine's integration into the European Union and NATO someday would constitute a power shift that could rival the fall of the Berlin Wall and German unification or reunification. People say democracies are in crisis, but plenty of autocracies are equally so or are about to be. The G7 was considered irrelevant a few years ago, but is now proving to be a cohesive bloc. So is NATO, which is now welcoming new members who a few years ago did not even think of ever joining. The West is back. The BRICS group, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the BRICS group is also expanding, but it is not built on shared values. There is not an assessment from my side, but just an observation. But we have to be honest. With a possible new US administration after 2024, those shared values may also come under pressure in the G7 and NATO as well. The world is multipolar, but there is also a global bipolar systemic rivalry between the two global actors in the economic and military spheres. It will not disappear rapidly. In the United States Congress, there is a bipartisan support on China policy. That too is just an observation. However, we have to dig deeper into the topic. A global actor does not mean that a country is a global ruler. Who rules the world? Question mark. How far does the influence of great powers extend? Question mark. In the end, who won the war in Vietnam? Not a global actor. Who had to leave Afghanistan? And no one had enough influence on Israel for humanitarian law to be respected in Gaza after the murderous raid by terrorists on October the 7th of this year. Did China have an impact on Russia in the war in Ukraine, even though it was not happy about the launching of this conflict? Another example, the war in Iraq ended with a pro-Iranian government in Iraq, in Baghdad. This was not the purpose. The Russian invasion dramatically missed the target of annexing Ukraine in its entirety. So the list of failures on all sides is long. Dear students, nobody is ruling the world. I know comparisons sometimes fall short, but within the EU, there is rather a shift from the bipolar Franco-German axis to more multipolarity. The war in Ukraine has given a stronger voice to a number of Central and Eastern European countries. The internally difficult political situation in the two largest economies of the European Union has reduced their political impact on the 25 other member states. So the world is changing, but within the EU, there are also changes in power structures that has to be mentioned. All this makes it difficult to paint a coherent picture of the world we live in. Everything flows, pantare, said the ancient Greeks. It is more true than ever. But despite everything, we must not resign ourselves fatalistically to the current rather gloomy reality. We can change things. Dangers and fear shouldn't paralyze us. This is not the case today, by the way. We still live, especially in Europe, in very vital societies and economies. The digital revolution is the most telling example of this. And it's also changing people themselves and their way of life. The technological revolution shows that we do not just undergo history, but make history. And shows that we are not experiencing the end of history. The European Union is also an example of how history can be changed. Brexit is a one-off, and I don't even know if it is not reversible in the longer term. There is now a queue of countries that are candidate members of the European Union, totaling about 65 million people, as many as the UK today. I do not know when the countries of the European or the remaining Western Balkans or the three countries of the former Eastern Partnership, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, will join. I don't know it. But most of them will join sooner or later. It will oblige the Union to lighten and to change its own decision-making process. Third series of reflections. As I said, economic globalization is taking new forms. The three global actors want to be more strategically autonomous, less dependent on each other in domains mainly related to their security, their economic security, and their military security. As I already said, global distrust has increased enormously. The fear of a repeat of a war, this time outside Europe, I think at the Taiwan Strait, weighs on the relations between the major powers because the consequences are incalculable. Fortunately, that realization is starting to sink in. The US-China summit and the upcoming EU-China summit in December hopefully show the beginning of a dawn, famous word coming from the Cold War. Thinking of the war in Ukraine, I have to recall a harsh reality. In history, wars end on the battlefield, not at the negotiating table. It was the case with World War I, World War II, and so many other wars. After the end of the war in Ukraine, we need to work on restoring global trust or less distrust. A détente, another word coming from the Cold War. A détente, especially between China, the US, and the European Union, knowing very well that the pre-invasion time is not coming back soon. The EU itself, for whom the war was a total surprise, has become much less naive. What is the main lesson we draw from this? Economic interdependence does not necessarily lead to peace worldwide, as it did in the European Union itself. What was valid for the Union is not valid apparently for the world as a whole. We must continue to work for an open world, despite the difficulties, within the constraints imposed by the will to become more strategically autonomous. This is a political choice. Incidentally, China and the US also have this policy of becoming less dependent on other global actors. But there is still a lot of room there for trade and investment in areas unrelated to security. The EU is still negotiating free trade agreements with other countries, Western countries and non-Western countries. Globalization is not over. The goal of remaining open is challenging, also internally. In democracies, there is a threat of political extremism that struggles with open societies and open economies. Fortunately, despite the growth of populism, no European country is even considering leaving the European Union. The example of Brexit acts as a kind of deterrent. Authoritarian regimes often revert to nationalism to preserve internal social cohesion, but nationalism always ultimately leads to protectionism. President Mitterrand even once said, nationalism equals war. Le nationalisme, c'est la guerre. Openness without the naivety of the past leads to peace and prosperity. My fourth series of thoughts: on the economic front, structural changes are also occurring as a result of the war and also as a result of COVID. The rise in energy prices changed the competitive relations between countries, including within the G7. The EU's almost complete abandonment of Russian gas and oil imports in less than 1 year obviously has a cost. After all, part of the European Union economy benefited from low Russian gas prices. The US energy-consuming companies are taking advantage of the shale revolution, shale oil and gas, of the last 2 decades. Gas prices are still several times higher in the European Union than in the United States. Similar European companies are now under competitive pressure, and a number of them are relocating or considering relocation. It is a new stage in the deindustrialization of the European Union, leading to frustration and leading to anger. Competitiveness is not just a matter of cost, but also a matter of nature and quality of goods and services. The Union is strong in scientific research, and the best known is the Horizon Europe program, which is the largest scientific program in the world. Converting inventiveness to innovation, converting this drive to invention to an economic translation is much harder in Europe than in the United States. The lack of venture capital in a fragmented financial market is a real and major handicap. In general, scale matters. The European countries must agree much more than in the past on common European projects. The Union lacks big companies in the new technologies. I repeat, size matters. The Magnificent Seven, they are called in that way, the Magnificent Seven technological companies are all American, you know them by heart. In general, we lag behind Chinese state-owned companies and the American giants. We are also too dependent in chips, batteries, rare earths from other countries and other companies. Hard work is being done there by the European institutions. Let me give you an example to reverse that trend. Since the European Commission proposed the European Chips Act in February last year, more than 90 billion euros of industrial investments have been announced. Another example, we as the European Union are among the world's leaders in many areas of the fight against climate change. For example, in renewable energy. Most EU countries will hit their 2030 renewable targets ahead of time. The bloc added 41 gigawatts of new solar capacity in 2022, a 40% increase on 2021. As I said, no one can and should reverse globalization as such and fall back on only relations, trade relations, economic relations between the so-called like-minded countries. That risk exists. It is therefore very important to have free and fair trade in non-security related activities. There too, the situation is still unclear, even between the US and the European Union. I'm thinking of government subsidies on climate investments, and even within the Union, the Commission has to be on guard against possible distortions of the single market by national subsidies and protective measures. Smaller EU countries risk falling victim to this because they have not the same room of maneuver as bigger countries as far as subsidies are concerned. I repeat it for the third time, the EU has unlearned naivety. I witnessed as President of the European Council, almost 10 years ago, the solar panel catastrophe, where member states almost forbade the Commission from acting for fear of reprisals from the side of China. That industry of solar panels has been wiped out in Europe, wiped out. Some fear the same when it comes to electric cars. And I hear the same arguments as the time for doing nothing from the European side. I give you an example, a positive example of EU action. If competitors of the EU have lower environmental standards, a special import tax is called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. A special import tax restores that skew. That is protection. That is not protectionism. You can call it reciprocity. That's different from retaliation. And it is not a play on words. Structural changes in our economy. The labor market looks completely different after COVID. In the OECD countries, there is hardly any rise in unemployment despite the economic slowdown. There are labor shortages in almost all sectors. For instance, both low-skilled and higher skilled, in the private sector and in the non-profit, such as education and care. The demographic downturn in Europe plays a role in this very special new situation on the labor market. I have to add that the same is happening in China, in Japan, and in Russia, as far as the demographic downturn is concerned. In Europe, we need migration for economic reasons, but many reject it for societal reasons. Migration will not disappear from our political agenda in the coming decades. The population of sub-Saharan Africa could grow to 3.4 billion by the end of the century. Today, they have around 1 billion inhabitants. And those 3.4 billion at the end of this century is more than twice as much as India at the time. A number of Central and Eastern European member states and candidate members are now experiencing more emigration and brain drain than immigration. Some of them know the two movements at the same time. Low-educated people try to enter, and higher educated people leave those Central and Eastern European countries. A very specific problematic. My last series of reflections about the list of priorities for policy is changing profoundly. I mentioned that. Security and climate now top higher than the traditional economic agenda. But what I wanted to emphasize is the functioning of our institutions is changing accordingly. And I explain this change in the functioning of our institutions. The state and politics play a key role here. By the way, COVID showed that without a strong state, we could not ensure the health of our population. That does not have much to do with ideology, but with survival. We cannot combat climate change, another example, without legally enshrined European-wide climate objectives. Here again, politics play an indispensable role. The state was already important in the Union anyway, mainly because of the choice of the welfare state. On average, government spending here exceeds 49% of GDP. In the US, it is 39%, less than the European Union, but still a gigantic amount. In the free market country of the United States, almost 40% go to public expenditures. In the midst of growing inequalities and the aging of the population, this share of the state, the share of public expenditure will not decrease. No climate policy is conceivable without legal targets, especially at the European level, without the state. I said it already, I repeat it because it's so important. In transition, state subsidies are inevitable, even and especially in countries that are the champions of the free economy. Without obligations, legal obligations, without subsidies, nothing happens on climate change. And we have to admit that climate policy is meeting increasing resistance from citizens and businesses as the price to be paid for it becomes visible. The social dimension is also back. The demand for burden sharing on climate change is increasing within and between countries, even worldwide. And the topic is becoming increasingly pressing at COP conferences. Next one, it will be in Dubai. So we have to keep, in the midst of this growing criticism on climate change policies, we have to keep the long term in mind. Those who often accuse politicians of succumbing to short-termism are now pleading more and more loudly for precisely short-termism. It's also another paradox. So democratic national governments face difficult choices. I sympathize a little bit with them, knowing what all this means, making difficult choices. Never in the Union have there been so many minority and multi-party coalitions in the member states, which makes governing more complicated. Belief in political democracy has become low. Evidence is provided by lower voter participation rates and opinion polls showing that sometimes 1 in 5 citizens say they do not oppose a strong leader. But those same skeptical people cannot imagine giving up their free speech on social media. another paradox. Weakened traditional parties have a smaller power base to show so-called leadership, to take, in other words, difficult, often unpopular decisions. Consequently, too few policy results can be achieved. And citizens then say the ruling parties are failing, forgetting that they themselves have not given them a sufficient majority to act decisively. It's a vicious circle. It's more than a paradox. It is also true that classical political parties fail too often by not taking the concerns of many sufficiently into account. Given the multiplicity of opinions in a democratic and individualized society, the feeling can easily arise that my private opinion has not been taken into account. In an individualized society, the individual feels he is not heard. Another paradox. Whence comes the leadership deficit? But you have a democratic deficit, you also can have a leadership deficit. The leadership has to make choices in a fragmented society and thus disappoint many. And yet populism is a big minority in the European Union. Where populists are in power, they are becoming more moderate, pardon me to use that word, at least in a number of domains. Look at Italy. I spoke about populism as a minority. In Poland, by far the biggest country in Central Europe, with its 38 million inhabitants, 4 times more than Hungary. In Poland, the rule of law and democracy will prevail again after the elections. As mentioned, the EU dimension has become inevitable for national democracies. Many national political leaders make electoral promises for which the national framework is no longer adapted. I know how difficult in an age of social media it is, but more than ever, political courage is needed. However, responsibility must be taken in civil society as well. To conclude, the last thing the world needs are wars. Amid an ongoing climate tragedy and after a 3 years COVID time with millions of deaths. Of course, those under attack must defend themselves, albeit not by any means. We will never be able to say enough how blessed we are in the European Union these days, that we have almost 75 years of peace. Everything is temporary in life, even peace. But let's make the temporary last as long as possible. That is our duty, that is our mission. Thank you so much.